My name is Hilda, and I am 60 years old. For most of my life, I believed family was everything, that love and blood were stronger than any storm. But 3 days ago, my entire world was torn apart. My own son, Damien, and his wife, Melissa, took my husband, Henry, and me to a mountain trail. They smiled, laughed, and told us it was a celebration of our 40 years of marriage. Then, with hands I once held as a child, Damien shoved us off a 90-foot cliff. The air rushed past me like the sound of 1,000 screams, and the only thing louder was the breaking of my bones against the rocks below. I tasted blood, I felt my ribs shatter, and I thought this was the end. But as I lay there broken, barely breathing, Henry's whisper reached my ear. "Hilda, don't move. Play dead." And in that moment, I realized something far worse than pain, something I had ignored for decades, hidden under the illusion of love and family loyalty. Because before the cliff, before the betrayal, before the blood, there was another tragedy. A secret buried 25 years ago, one so dark it poisoned everything we thought was good. My son Richard's death was never an accident, and Henry, my husband, knew the truth all along. But before I tell you how a family built on love turned into a nightmare of betrayal, let me ask you something. What would you do if your own child, the one you raised, fed, and sacrificed everything for, looked you in the eye and tried to end your life? Could you forgive them? Or would you fight to your last breath to see justice done? Drop your answer in the comments, because I want to hear your voice. And while you're here, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Because this story isn't just mine, it's a warning to every parent, every spouse, every family that thinks this could never happen to us. Now let me take you back not to the cliff, not to the hospital, but to the beginning. To the life Henry and I built, the family dinners, the laughter, the Sunday walks, the house that smelled of coffee and sawdust. It all looked so perfect from the outside. But hidden inside those walls was the first crack, the first shadow, the first sign that our story was never what it seemed. When I look back now, it almost feels like I lived two completely different lives. The first one was painted in warm colors, quiet mornings, and small-town routines. That was the life I believed in, the perfect family life. The second one, darker, hidden beneath, was already waiting to swallow me whole. Henry and I married young, when we had nothing but hope. We started in a little 2-bedroom house on the edge of a quiet suburban street. Every morning, I brewed coffee while Henry fixed the squeaky screen door or sharpened his tools in the shed. The smell of sawdust clung to him no matter how many times he washed his shirts, and I secretly loved it. He was a carpenter by trade, an artist by heart. His hands could transform raw wood into pieces of beauty: tables, chairs, rocking cribs. People in town said his furniture carried his soul, and maybe they were right. I was a school teacher, spending my days with children who never stopped surprising me. I'd come home with funny stories about little Timmy who ate glue, or Sarah who insisted dinosaurs still lived in the woods behind our school. Henry would laugh while sanding down an oak board, and sometimes he'd pause, brush sawdust off his forehead, and say, "You know, Hilda, we have the best life. Simple, but the best." And for a long time, I believed him. We had 2 boys. Richard, our firstborn, came into the world loud and full of light. He had Henry's hands, always eager to help, and my curiosity, always asking questions. By the time he was 10, he was already fixing things in the workshop, making birdhouses with his father, and telling me not to lift heavy groceries. "I got it, Mom," he'd say with that wide grin. He was the soul of our home. Then came Damien, 5 years younger, quieter from the very beginning. He didn't run into my arms the way Richard did. He didn't chatter about his day at school. Instead, he would sit by the window, tracing shapes in the condensation on the glass. I told myself children were just different, that love could come in many shapes. So I gave him the same hugs, the same lullabies, the same bedtime stories. I promised myself I wouldn't play favorites. At least, that's what I thought. Sundays were sacred. After church, our house would fill with smells of roast chicken and baked bread. We'd gather around the oak table Henry carved with his own hands, its surface smooth from years of elbows and spilled milk. Richard would talk about his dreams of becoming an engineer, building bridges and skyscrapers. His eyes lit up when he spoke, as if the whole future stretched out in front of him like a shining road. Damien, on the other hand, would push his food around his plate, silent, his eyes fixed on the wood grain of the table. I would reach out, touch his hand, and say, "You okay, honey?" He always nodded, but his silence spoke louder than words. Our sisters and cousins often joined us for dinners. My sisters Harriet and Irene would bring casseroles, their kids running wild through the yard, climbing Henry's ladders, leaving sticky fingerprints on my clean windows. The men would gather outside to fix something because in our family there was always something to fix while the women swapped recipes and stories in the kitchen. The house rang with laughter and chaos, and every time I looked around I thought, this is heaven. This is everything I ever wanted. Henry was my anchor through it all. Even after 40 years of marriage, he still came home with wildflowers he picked by the roadside, setting them in a jar on the kitchen counter. He still called me darlin' when no one else was around. At night, when the world went quiet, we'd sit on the porch in rocking chairs, holding hands, watching the stars. We'd talk about the trips we'd take when we retired, about how we'd see the ocean for the first time, how we'd spoil our grandchildren rotten. Life was so ordinary, so beautifully ordinary, that I never saw the storm gathering behind it. I thought we were preparing for sunsets and rocking chairs. I never realized we were training for survival walking trails that would one day lead us to a cliff where everything shattered. But even before that day, cracks had begun to show. Richard and Damien's relationship was complicated. At first, it was small things, arguments over chores, who got the bigger slice of pie, who borrowed whose bike without asking. But as they grew older, the tension sharpened. Sometimes I'd catch them whispering in the hallway, voices tense, only for silence to fall the moment I appeared. When I asked, Henry would shrug and say, "Brothers, they'll work it out." And I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him, because to admit otherwise would mean admitting something was wrong in the family I worked so hard to build. Still, I saw things. I saw the way Richard's jaw clenched when Damien entered the room. I saw the way Damien's eyes, those quiet eyes, held something I couldn't name. Resentment, maybe, or something colder. But back then, I pushed it aside. I clung to the dream of the perfect family life. I told myself love was enough, that faith was enough, that blood was enough. How wrong I was. Because one October night, when Richard was 20, all the laughter, all the warmth, all the promises of family would collapse into the dark silence of a gorge. And I would begin the second life, the one defined, not by love, but by betrayal. It was a cold October evening, the kind where the air feels sharper than usual, carrying with it the smell of damp leaves and wood smoke. I had made Richard's favorite stew for dinner. The table was set, Henry had washed up, and Damien sat at his usual place, flipping the pages of a school book without really reading. But Richard didn't come home. At first I thought he was late because of classes or maybe helping a friend with his car. He was responsible, always letting me know if something changed. By 9 o'clock, I began pacing the living room. By 10, I called his best friend, no answer. By 11, I stared at the clock so long it seemed the second hand mocked me with each tick. "Maybe he lost track of time," Henry said, rubbing my shoulders. But his voice lacked conviction. Damien, sitting at the kitchen table, didn't look worried. He just kept staring at the wood grain, his lips pressed in a line. "Damien," I asked, "did Richard say where he was going?" He shook his head without meeting my eyes. Something about that simple gesture struck me as wrong. At midnight, Henry grabbed his coat and flashlight. "I'll go out with the neighbors. We'll check the trails." I wanted to go too, but he told me to stay by the phone in case Richard called. Damien retreated to his room, and I sat in the living room chair, clutching the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. The hours crawled by. At 2 a.m, I heard footsteps on the porch and ran to the door, praying it was Richard. But it was Henry, his face pale, his flashlight beam shaking. Behind him were 2 neighbors, their eyes heavy with sorrow. "Hilda," Henry whispered, and the way he said my name told me everything before he spoke the words. "They found him, by the river gorge." The world tilted. My knees gave out, and Henry caught me before I hit the ground. "No, no, no," I screamed, the sound tearing through the night. "Not my boy, not Richard." The police came, their faces grim but efficient. They told me it looked like an accident, that Richard must have slipped on the rocks and fallen into the gorge. His body was broken, his clothes soaked, his eyes closed forever. They said it was quick. They said he didn't suffer. But mothers always know when someone is lying to soften the blow. The funeral was the darkest day of my life. I wore the same black dress I'd worn when we buried my mother, but this time the fabric felt heavier, suffocating. My tears didn't stop. I cried until my throat burned, until my body shook with sobs. People hugged me, whispered condolences, told me time would heal, but nothing healed the gaping wound of losing a child. What disturbed me most wasn't just Richard's absence, but Damien's strange calmness. He stood beside me, his face expressionless, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He didn't cry, didn't shake, didn't cling to me the way I expected. He just stared ahead, silent, like a statue. At the burial, while my body shook with grief, Damien bent down, placed a flower on his brother's coffin, and whispered something I couldn't hear. When I asked later, he said, "Goodbye." Just that. One word, flat and final, with no trace of emotion. Even now, when I think about it, a chill creeps down my spine. Henry, on the other hand, never left my side that day. He held me upright when my legs refused to move. He whispered, "I've got you," over and over again, though his eyes carried a weight I couldn't understand back then. After the funeral, our house felt haunted. Richard's chair at the dinner table sat empty. His laughter no longer echoed down the hallway. His shoes still sat by the door, as if he'd come back any moment. I clung to his belongings, sniffing his shirts just to catch the fading scent of him. Every night, I lay awake wondering, why him, God? Why not me? Damien's behavior confused me even more. In the weeks following the funeral, he became strangely attentive. He'd help me with chores, bring me cups of tea, sit quietly with me when I cried. He accompanied Henry in the workshop, learning carpentry as if he suddenly wanted to fill the hole Richard left behind. At first, I thought it was grief. People cope in different ways, I told myself. Maybe this was his way of healing, of stepping up. But late at night, sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of his face in the dim light, and what I saw wasn't grief. It was something else, something I didn't want to name. His eyes would linger too long on the family photographs, his expression unreadable. Once, I walked into the kitchen and found him sitting in the dark, staring at Richard's high school diploma that hung on the wall. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled faintly and said, "Just thinking." Life went on, or at least pretended to. I returned to teaching, though every child's laugh was a knife twisting in my chest. Henry worked longer hours in his shop, the rhythmic sound of his tools masking the silence in our home. Damien grew into a man, married Melissa, and eventually had children of his own. We rebuilt, brick by fragile brick, the image of a family. But the truth was always there, buried like a splinter beneath the skin. I felt it when Damien hugged me with arms that never fully tightened. I sensed it when Melissa called me Mom, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I told myself the past was the past, that the tragedy was behind us. But the night Richard died was not an accident. It was the first fracture in the mask of our perfect family. And it would take 25 years, and a fall from a cliff, for me to finally learn the truth. After Richard's funeral, the house seemed quieter than death itself. The laughter that once echoed through our walls had vanished, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and the hollow sound of my own footsteps. For weeks, I lived in a haze, going through the motions, teaching my students, cooking meals, folding laundry, yet every task felt like acting in a play whose script I no longer understood. It was during this fragile time that Damien began to change. My younger son, once distant and aloof, transformed into what looked like the perfect child. He started joining me in the kitchen, offering to chop vegetables, asking if I needed help grading papers. Sometimes he'd even surprise me with little things: a bouquet of wildflowers, a steaming cup of tea when I couldn't sleep, a quiet "I love you, Mom," when he thought I needed it most. At first, I welcomed it. I told myself grief had matured him, that Richard's death had forced him to grow up. Henry praised him, saying, "See, Hilda, he's stepping up, he's becoming a man." And I wanted to believe it with all my heart. But there were moments, fleeting, subtle, when my instincts whispered otherwise, like the time I found him in Richard's room, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at his brother's soccer trophies. His face was blank, unreadable, but his hand kept clenching and unclenching around one of Richard's medals. When he noticed me, he slipped it into his pocket and smiled as if nothing had happened. I asked what he was doing. He just shrugged and said, I miss him too, Mom. Life moved forward, dragging me with it. Damien graduated, started working with Henry in the carpentry shop. To my surprise, he had talent. His hands, once clumsy, grew steady. He crafted tables, chairs, and cabinets with the same precision his father had. People in town praised his work. "That boy's got a gift," they'd tell me at the market. "You must be proud." And I was on the surface. Then came Melissa. She was a pretty young woman from the next town over, with glossy hair and a smile that could light up any room. She had a way of putting people at ease, and when Damien brought her home to meet us, I thought, finally, happiness has found him. She laughed at Henry's jokes, helped me in the kitchen, and called me Mom from the start. When they married, it was a small ceremony in a local church. I wore pale blue, clutching Henry's arm as we watched our surviving son vow to love and protect his bride. For a fleeting moment, I thought Richard was smiling down from heaven, blessing his brother's new chapter. Soon after, Damien and Melissa gave us 2 grandchildren, 2 beautiful children who became the light of my life. Their giggles, their sticky little hands tugging at my skirt, their innocent questions, they healed pieces of my broken heart. Whenever I held them, I whispered silent prayers. "Please, God, let them never know the pain I've known." Damien seemed happy too. He worked hard at his carpentry business, bought a modest house, took his family on outings. On the surface, he was everything a son should be: devoted, responsible, loving. For years I told myself that perhaps Richard's death had been the storm that reshaped us all. Perhaps we had survived the worst. But every now and then, shadows crept in. I'd catch Melissa's eyes lingering a little too long on the jewelry Henry bought me. Or I'd notice the way Damien's questions always circled back to money. "How much did that cost, Mom?" Or, "Do you and Dad have enough saved for retirement?" They were subtle, wrapped in casual tone, but I felt a prickle of unease. Still, I brushed it aside. After all, hadn't he earned the right to ask? He was family. He was my son. I told myself suspicion was unfair, even cruel. After Richard's death, I refused to believe anything could destroy what little family I had left. One evening, about 10 years after Richard's passing, Melissa came over while Damien worked late. She brought a casserole, set it down on the counter, and sat across from me with a glass of tea. "You know, Mom," she said sweetly, "you and Henry should think about downsizing. That big house must be hard to maintain. And expensive, too." Her tone was light, casual, but her eyes were calculating. I laughed nervously, brushing off the suggestion. "Oh, we'll manage," I said. "This house is our home. We built our lives here." She smiled, tilting her head, as if she'd expected that answer. "Of course. But think about it, you could sell it for a good price, put money aside for the future, maybe even help us with the kids' college someday." Her words lodged in my chest. Help them? Why did it sound less like a suggestion and more like a plan? When I told Henry about it later, he shrugged. "She's just being practical. Young people think about the future differently." But something in my gut told me Melissa's interest wasn't innocent. Years rolled on, the grandchildren grew, and Damien's visits became more frequent, but never without an undertone of calculation. He and Melissa asked more questions, offered more advice, slipped more hints about wills, insurance, and property value. And all the while, I clung to the illusion. Because the alternative that my surviving son and his perfect little family were wearing masks was too painful to face. Only now, looking back, I understand. Damien wasn't stepping up out of love. He was building something else entirely. A mask, carefully carved like one of his wooden chairs, polished until it gleamed. Behind that mask, the boy I once rocked to sleep was gone. What remained was a man who knew how to smile, how to hug, how to say the right words while hiding the monster within. For 25 years, I convinced myself we had rebuilt a family. But the truth was, the foundation had rotted long ago, the day Richard fell into the gorge, and the mask would not last forever. It began innocently enough, or at least, that's what I told myself at the time. One evening, Damien sat at our kitchen table, his wife Melissa perched beside him like a delicate ornament, her manicured fingers wrapped around a mug of tea. He smiled, that same polite, polished smile I had grown used to over the years, and said, "Mom, Dad, you're both 60 now. Don't you think it's time to get your affairs in order? You know, just to be safe." I remember pausing mid-sip of coffee, blinking at him in surprise. "Affairs in order?" I repeated. Yes, Melissa chimed in quickly, stroking my hand with such exaggerated tenderness it made me uneasy. We love you both so much, and we just want to make sure you're protected. You've worked hard your whole lives. Don't you think it's time to formalize things? Maybe a will? Henry, always more trusting, nodded thoughtfully. He's right, Hilda. It's responsible. But something in my gut twisted. Why now? Why so insistent? We had modest savings, about $200,000 total when you counted the house, the land I'd inherited from my parents, and what we'd carefully set aside over the decades. To us, it was the fruit of a lifetime of hard work. Henry's hands calloused from shaping wood, my back stiff from years standing in front of a chalkboard. It wasn't riches, but it was ours. Still, I agreed. Maybe it was practical. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Damien even recommended a lawyer, Albert, a man we'd known for years, who had helped several families in town with estate planning. That Tuesday afternoon, we sat in Albert's office. The air smelled of leather-bound books and old carpet. Papers shuffled, pens clicked. Damien leaned forward eagerly, speaking with a fluency that startled me. I think the best option is to name Melissa and me as the sole heirs. That way, when the time comes, we can make sure everything gets distributed fairly among the grandchildren. I frowned. But what about splitting it equally? Or putting it into a trust? Damien's tone softened, but there was a sharpness beneath it. Mom, Dad, you'll need us as you get older. It makes sense for us to have direct access to the resources so we can take care of you properly. Melissa nodded along, her voice syrupy sweet. It's just safer this way. You won't have to worry about complicated legal matters. I glanced at Henry. He hesitated, then smiled weakly. It sounds reasonable, Hilda. They're just looking out for us. So we signed. My hand trembled as I put pen to paper, but I told myself it was fine. Melissa hugged me afterward, her lips brushing my cheek as she whispered, "Now we're officially a united family forever." The words chilled me, though I didn't know why. From that day forward, their visits changed. They no longer came just to bring the kids over or to share a meal. Instead, every conversation turned toward finances, property, or the future. "Mom," Melissa said one afternoon, running her hand along the oak banister Henry built decades ago, "this house is far too big for just the two of you. Don't you think it would be smarter to sell it while the market is high? You could move into a cozy apartment in town. Less upkeep, less risk." I shook my head. "This house is our history. Every corner has a memory." I'll never forget the flicker of irritation in Damien's eyes when I said that. His voice, once calm, sharpened. "Mom, you're being irrational. If you fall down the stairs, what then? We can't always be here to rescue you." Melissa's hand tightened on mine, her smile never faltering. "We only want what's best for you." But her words rang hollow. That night, Henry and I argued something rare in our marriage. He thought they were just being practical, that I was overreacting. "Hilda, they're thinking ahead. We're not as young as we used to be." I slammed the dish towel on the counter. "Henry, don't you see? They're circling us like vultures. Every visit is about money now. Not family. Money." He rubbed his temples, sighing. "You're letting grief cloud your judgment. Damien loves us." But deep down, I knew my instincts weren't wrong. A few weeks later, Damien took it a step further. He arrived with Melissa, who set out a tray of tea and cookies as if it were her own kitchen. He cleared his throat and said, "Mom, Dad, I think it's time you gave me power of attorney, just for precaution. If either of you get sick, I can manage your affairs without complications." My stomach dropped. His tone was calm, logical, even affectionate, but the insistence in his eyes terrified me. I tried to mask my unease. "Son, your father and I are perfectly capable of managing our own lives. We don't need anyone to take control yet." He forced a smile, but his jaw tightened. "It's not about control, it's about responsibility." Melissa added quickly, "Exactly. We don't want you burdened with worry. Think of it as peace of mind." But to me, it felt like chains being quietly slipped over our wrists. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, every shadow in the room whispering doubt. Something wasn't right. Damien wasn't just interested, he was obsessed. And Melissa, her sugary voice and perfect hugs were starting to feel like rehearsed lines in a cruel play. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. Why was Damien, who supposedly had a thriving carpentry business, so intent on controlling our money? Why the urgency, the pressure? My unease grew until it was a constant knot in my chest. And when I finally confided in my sister Harriet, her reaction confirmed my fears. "Hilda," she said firmly, her voice heavy with warning, "doesn't it strike you as strange that Damien, who should be doing fine financially, suddenly cares so much about your savings? Wake up, something is wrong." Her words were like a slap, forcing me to confront what I'd tried to deny. And for the first time, I began to wonder if Damien's interest in our finances wasn't about care or responsibility at all, but about finishing something he had started 25 years ago. The knot in my chest refused to loosen. Harriet's words replayed in my head like a drumbeat. "Wake up, something is wrong." For days, I studied Damien more closely. I watched his smile, how it never reached his eyes. I noticed how Melissa's hugs lingered just a second too long, as if trying to soften me before she slipped another suggestion into conversation. Every word they spoke about taking care of us felt less like love and more like a rehearsal for something darker. One afternoon, Damien arrived unannounced. He walked into the living room as if he owned it, Melissa setting down a plate of cookies with that dazzling smile she always wore. "Mom, Dad," Damien began, his voice smooth, "have you thought about our conversation? The power of attorney? It's just practical." I forced myself to stay calm. "Son," I said, "your father and I are still in our right minds. Why is it so important for you to manage our finances?" For a moment, the mask slipped. Damien's face hardened, his eyes sharp and cold. It was only for a heartbeat, but in that flicker I saw something I couldn't unsee, a shadow that reminded me of the way he looked at Richard years ago, when they thought I wasn't watching. Melissa jumped in quickly, her voice sweet but firm. "Hilda, it's not about control. It's about love. You've always taken care of everyone else. Let us take care of you." But the way she said "take care" made my skin crawl. That night, Henry and I had our first serious argument in years. I paced the kitchen while he stood at the sink, washing dishes as if he could scrub away the tension. "Henry, don't you see what's happening?" I demanded. "They're not visiting to spend time with us. They're circling us like hawks, waiting for us to fall." He shook his head, his voice calm but tired. "Hilda, you're reading too much into this. Damien is just being responsible. We should be grateful." "Grateful?" My voice cracked. "For what? For them pressuring us to sell the house we built our lives in? For them asking for control over every dollar we've saved? Doesn't any of this strike you as strange?" Henry put the dish down and turned to me, his expression weary. "They're family. Damien is our son. You're letting grief twist your thoughts." I slammed my hand on the counter, my heart pounding. "Henry, don't you remember what Damien was like before Richard died? Don't you remember that coldness in him? The way he acted at the funeral, like he had lost nothing?" For the first time, I saw something flicker in Henry's eyes. A shadow of doubt. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then whispered, "Hilda, there's something I never told you." The room went still. My heart thudded so loudly, I thought it might drown out his words. "What do you mean?" He sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his shoulders slumped, his hands trembling. "There are things about Richard's death I kept from you, things I thought I was protecting you from." I stared at him, the walls of my world beginning to crack. "What are you saying, Henry?" His voice broke. "That night, I saw something between the boys, and I should have told you years ago." My knees weakened, and I gripped the counter to steady myself. The silence between us was deafening, filled only with the hum of the refrigerator and the pounding of my heart. "You need to tell me everything," I whispered. "Right now." Henry buried his face in his hands. "If I do, Hilda, nothing will ever be the same." And in that moment, I realized the truth I had been running from my whole life. The night Richard died, it wasn't an accident, and Henry had been carrying that secret for 25 years. My breath caught in my throat. My skin went cold. My heart screamed with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. But I had to know. Because if my instincts were right, if Harriet's warning was right, then the son I had clung to, the only child I thought I had left, was not my savior. He was my greatest danger. Henry sat hunched at the kitchen table, his rough carpenter's hands trembling against the wood he had sanded smooth decades ago. For a long time, he didn't speak. The silence pressed on me like a weight, heavy and suffocating. Finally, he raised his eyes, and in them I saw something I had never seen before in 40 years of marriage. Shame. Hilda, he whispered. The night Richard died, I wasn't at home when you thought I was. I followed him. I felt my blood run cold. Followed him? Why? Because I saw Damien leave the house, Henry said, his voice breaking. He told us he was studying, but I knew he wasn't. Something about his eyes, the way he slammed the door, it didn't sit right with me. Then Richard stormed out a little while later, furious, clutching papers in his hand. I followed because I was afraid something was going to happen. My legs threatened to give out, so I lowered myself into the chair across from him. What did you see? My voice was barely more than a whisper. Henry's hands tightened around each other, as if holding back a lifetime of guilt. I found them near the gorge. They were screaming at each other. Richard was waving those papers, yelling, "You're a thief, Damien! You're stealing from Mom and Dad!" The kitchen seemed to shrink around me. My breath came in short gasps. Stealing? Henry nodded, his eyes clouded with grief. Richard had discovered that Damien had been taking money from our savings account. At first, small amounts so small we didn't notice, but then bigger withdrawals. Richard had been investigating for months. He had proof. That's what he was holding in his hands that night. I pressed my hand against my mouth, the edges of my world crumbling. Oh, God. Richard told Damien he was going to tell us everything. Henry continued, his voice breaking. He said he couldn't keep quiet while Damien stole from his own family. Damien, he snapped. He shouted that Richard had always been the favorite, that he got everything while Damien got nothing. The words they threw at each other. Henry shook his head. It was like watching fire and gasoline collide. And then? I pushed, though part of me didn't want to hear the rest. Henry's eyes filled with tears. Damien shoved him. It wasn't a stumble. It wasn't an accident. He pushed Richard with both hands, full of rage. I saw Richard try to regain his balance, saw him claw at the air for something to grab onto. But the ground crumbled beneath him, and then he was gone. A scream tore from my throat, but no sound came out. My body shook so violently I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. You saw him kill our son, and you never told me? Henry's face contorted with grief. He was crying when I reached him, Hilda. He kept saying it was an accident, that Richard slipped while trying to hit him. He begged me not to tell you, not to go to the police. He swore it was a mistake, that he hadn't meant it. I stared at him. My vision blurred with tears. And you believed him? I wanted to, Henry admitted, his voice raw. Because Richard was already gone. Because I couldn't bear the thought of losing Damien too. I told myself it was a tragic accident, that he would learn, that he would change. I thought protecting him was protecting you, protecting what little family we had left. I slammed my hand on the table so hard the sound echoed through the kitchen. Protecting me? You let me bury my son without knowing the truth. You let me cry on Damien's shoulder, thinking he was grieving, when all along he was the reason our boy was in the ground. Henry's tears spilled freely. I thought I was saving us, Hilda, but all I did was chain us to a lie. The room spun around me. Every memory of the last 25 years twisted into something grotesque. Damien's sudden devotion after Richard's death, his attentiveness, his charm. It hadn't been love. It had been camouflage, a mask to hide the monster beneath. I gripped the edge of the table, my nails digging into the wood. Did he ever return the money? The money he stole? Henry's silence was answer enough. He promised he would, Henry finally said, his voice hollow. Said he'd taken it for a business investment that went wrong. Swore he'd pay it back little by little, but he never did. And every time I saw the accounts dwindling, I told myself confronting him would destroy us all. So I stayed silent. And by staying silent, I became his accomplice. I buried my face in my hands, sobs racking my body. My God, all these years I've been living in a lie, loving a lie, defending a lie. Henry reached across the table, but I pulled my hands away. I couldn't stand his touch. You should have told me, I whispered. I had the right to know. He nodded, his face broken. I know, and I will carry that guilt to my grave. The kitchen felt like a tomb, filled with ghosts of secrets too heavy to bear. My heart pounded with rage and grief, my mind a whirl of questions. How much money had Damien stolen? How many lies had we swallowed? And most terrifying of all, if he had killed his own brother over money, what would stop him from doing the same to us? That night, lying in bed beside Henry, I stared at the ceiling until dawn. His confession had changed everything. My surviving son wasn't just selfish or manipulative, he was dangerous. A murderer who had lived in our home, eaten at our table, kissed my cheek on Mother's Day. And now, 25 years later, he was circling us again. The inheritance, the house, the savings, the power of attorney. It wasn't love that drove Damien's sudden devotion. It was greed. The same greed that pushed Richard into a gorge. The same greed that would push Henry and me to our deaths if we weren't careful. For the first time, I truly feared my own son. The phone rang on a quiet Thursday evening. I had just finished grading a stack of my former students' essays. I still volunteered sometimes at the school, and Henry was in his workshop sanding down an old rocking chair. When I saw Damien's name flash on the caller ID, my stomach clenched. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice sugar-sweet. "Melissa and I were talking, and we thought it would be beautiful to celebrate your 40th wedding anniversary with something special. How about we take you up to the mountains this weekend? You've always dreamed of going. We could hike, take pictures, have a family picnic. A perfect day together." His words should have sounded loving. Instead, they felt like an execution order dressed up in wrapping paper. I forced my voice to stay steady. "That's thoughtful, Damien. Let me talk to your father, and we'll call you back." When I hung up, Henry was already standing in the doorway, his face pale. He had heard enough to understand. We didn't speak for a long moment, the silence louder than any words. Then I whispered, "He's inviting us to our own funeral." Henry nodded grimly. "Just like Richard, at the gorge." That night we didn't sleep. We lay side by side in our bed, holding hands, whispering plans like fugitives. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. "We can't go," I said desperately. "We'll make an excuse, pretend I'm sick." Henry shook his head. "If we refuse, they'll find another way. A car accident, a fire, something that looks even more natural. At least in the mountains, we know what they'll try. We can prepare." His words chilled me, but I knew he was right. "What do we do?" I asked. Henry's eyes darkened with determination. "We go, but we make sure they can't cover it up. I'll hide my phone and set it to record. If we survive, we'll have evidence. And if we don't," his voice cracked, "at least someone will know the truth." The next day, Henry wrote a letter. He sealed it in an envelope addressed to my sister Harriet and tucked it away with our important documents. In it, he detailed everything. Richard's death, Damien's thefts, the pressure about the will, and our suspicion that they were planning to kill us. "If we don't come back," he told me, his hands shaking as he sealed it, "Harriet will know where to look. The truth won't die with us." Friday night felt like a Last Supper. We ate dinner in silence, barely touching our food. Every creak of the house made me jump. I looked around the kitchen, at the walls Henry had painted, the curtains I had sewn, the table where Richard once did his homework. I tried to memorize every detail, as if I knew I might never see them again. Before bed, Henry pulled me close. "Hilda," he whispered, "if something happens tomorrow, I want you to know that loving you has been the greatest blessing of my life." I clung to him, my tears soaking his shirt. "Don't say goodbye," I begged. "Not yet." Saturday morning dawned bright and cruelly beautiful. The sky was clear, the air crisp, the kind of day that should have been perfect for a family outing. Damien arrived early, whistling a cheerful tune that twisted my stomach. "Morning, lovebirds," he called as he stepped inside. "Ready for your big adventure?" Melissa followed, radiant as a bride, carrying a shopping bag. I bought supplies for our picnic: cookies, fruit, water, everything we'll need. She held up each item like a child showing off toys. "And look, my new camera. I want to capture every moment." Her smile was dazzling, but all I could think was, she wants photos of our bodies at the bottom of a cliff. Damien set down his backpack with a heavy thud. I glanced at it and felt the blood drain from my face. Inside, I saw ropes, harnesses, a first aid kit, even what looked like a small shovel. "What's all that for?" I asked, my voice thin. "For safety," he said smoothly. "Can't be too careful on the trail." Every word sounded like mockery. Safety equipment, brought not to protect us, but to stage the perfect accident. During breakfast, which Henry and I could barely eat, Damien laid out a map on the table. "It's a beautiful trail," he explained, pointing. "We'll end at a lookout where you can see the entire valley. The views are spectacular." Melissa leaned in, her eyes shining. "Don't worry, it's easy." Even kids can do it." Her tone was reassuring, but to me it felt like a cruel joke. Henry and I exchanged a look. We both knew. This was it. As we loaded into the car, my hands trembled so badly I could barely buckle my seatbelt. Melissa played cheerful music on the radio, singing along as if we were heading to a picnic. Damien drove carefully, obeying every stop sign, every speed limit. He didn't want any accidents except the one he had planned. Halfway through the ride, Henry discreetly reached over and pressed my hand. I felt the vibration in his pocket where his phone had been switched to record. Every word, every sound from this point forward would be captured. Proof, if we survived. The 2-hour drive felt like an eternity. My chest tightened with every mile closer to the mountains. I stared out the window at the trees, the rolling hills, the bright sky, thinking bitterly how beautiful nature was when it became the backdrop for betrayal. When we finally arrived at the trailhead, Damien's smile widened. "Perfect day for a hike," he said, slinging the heavy backpack over his shoulders. Melissa snapped pictures immediately, cooing, "This is going to be such a special memory." Henry and I shared one last silent glance, both of us thinking the same thing. Yes, a memory, but not the one you expect. We started walking, each step pulling us closer to the trap my son had set. And though fear gnawed at me with every breath, another feeling grew stronger, something I hadn't felt in years. Rage. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. This wasn't just about inheritance. This was about Richard, about the son I lost 25 years ago. And I swore to myself, as I followed Damien up that trail, that I would not let history repeat itself. Not without a fight. The trail began gently, winding between towering pines and moss-covered rocks. Birds flitted overhead, their songs a cruel contrast to the dread pressing down on my chest. Melissa walked ahead, camera swinging from her neck, snapping photo after photo as though this were any ordinary hike. "Look at those wildflowers," she exclaimed, pointing at a patch of yellow blossoms. "Oh, Hilda, you and Henry should stand there for a picture." I forced a smile while my insides twisted. Each click of her camera felt less like a memory and more like evidence to be used later, proof of our happy family day before tragedy struck. Damien lingered behind us, close enough to feel his presence like a shadow, but far enough to make me uneasy. Every time I slowed, I could sense his eyes burning into my back. He'd say things like, "You two doing okay? Need a rest?" But his concern dripped with false sweetness. Henry's hand occasionally brushed mine, a silent reminder that his phone was recording everything. An hour passed, the incline growing steeper. My legs ached, my breath came harder, and Henry was beginning to wheeze. We weren't used to this kind of climb, and I realized that was no accident. Damien and Melissa had chosen this trail precisely because it would exhaust us, weaken us, make us easier prey. "We're almost at the lookout," Melissa announced cheerfully, though I remembered Damien pointing to the map earlier. According to that, we still had at least another hour before the real lookout point. She was lying. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn back, but I pushed forward, clutching Henry's arm as we climbed. "Play along," I told myself. "Play along until we get the evidence." Then Melissa's voice rang out. "Oh, look at that." She pointed to the right, where a narrow path branched off toward a rocky cliff. "That view is incredible. Why don't we climb up there for some special photos?" My heart plummeted. The cliff rose about 90 feet above the trail, its edge jagged, its rocks loose. Below yawned a gorge filled with sharp boulders. It was the perfect place for an accident. "I don't know if that's a good idea," I said, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound casual. "That trail looks dangerous for people our age." But Damien was already moving toward it, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. "Come on, Mom, it'll only take a few minutes. The photos will be spectacular. Don't you want to remember this forever?" The word spectacular sent ice through my veins. I glanced at Henry. His lips were pressed thin, but he gave me a subtle nod. We had to go. If we refused, they'd just find another place, another excuse. Better to face the trap we knew. The climb to the cliff was brutal. Loose gravel slipped under my boots, and more than once I nearly fell. Damien's hand shot out to steady me each time, his grip too firm, almost possessive. Each touch felt like claws digging into my skin. Melissa darted ahead like a mountain goat, her laughter echoing across the rocks. Finally, we reached the top. The view truly was breathtaking rolling valleys, a river glinting in the sun, mountains stretching into the horizon. In another life, it might have been a beautiful family memory, but all I saw was a stage set for murder. "Stand here," Melissa chirped, positioning us near the very edge. "The valley makes the perfect background." Henry and I shuffled closer, our feet inches from the precipice. Damien stood just behind us, his shadow looming. Melissa lifted her camera, her smile finally dropping into something colder, sharper. "Now hug each other and smile." We obeyed, clinging to each other, hearts pounding. Each click of the camera felt like a countdown. "Take one more," Damien said. His voice had an edge now. "But this time, step back a little. It'll look better." One step back would put us directly on the cliff's edge. Henry's grip on my waist tightened. I looked up at him, and in his eyes I saw both terror and resolve. Melissa raised the camera one last time. Her voice was no longer sweet. It was icy. "Smile. This is going to be your last photo." Then Damien lunged. It happened in an instant, his hands slamming against our backs, the force driving us toward the abyss. I felt the ground crumble beneath me, the dizzying rush of open air. But Henry, quick as lightning, twisted, grabbing Damien's wrist and yanking him forward with us. "If we're going to die," Henry roared, his voice filled with fury I had never heard before, "you're coming with us." Melissa screamed, dropping the camera, as she rushed to grab Damien. The four of us tangled together in a macabre dance of death, teetering on the edge. My nails scraped rock, my body straining for balance, but gravity had already claimed us. We fell. The air screamed past my ears, my stomach lurching into my throat. For a heartbeat, time slowed. I thought of Richard, of how he must have felt when Damien pushed him 25 years ago. His arms flailing, his voice swallowed by the wind, his mother waiting at home, clueless. My tears mingled with the rushing air. Then the ground rose up to meet us. The impact was a thunderclap of agony. Bones cracked, flesh tore, pain seared through every nerve, my mouth filled with the metallic taste of blood. For a moment, darkness threatened to take me. But then, Henry's voice, weak but urgent. "Hilda, don't move, play dead." I forced myself to go still. My body screamed with pain, but I made my chest rise and fall so shallowly it would be invisible. I let my eyes glaze over, and in that awful silence, I heard them. Damien's groan, Melissa's whimper. They had survived too, but they were hurt. "Melissa," Damien rasped, his voice ragged. "Are you okay?" "I think my leg's broken," she whimpered. "It hurts so much." "Damien, what about them?" A pause. Then his voice, cold and certain. "They're dead. Both of them. Eyes open, no breath. It's over." His lie sent a flicker of hope through me. If they believed we were dead, maybe, just maybe, we had a chance. Melissa let out a bitter laugh. "Perfect. Just like we planned." And as they began to crawl away, discussing the story they would tell rescuers, I lay broken on the rocks, praying the act would hold. Praying the truth would finally come to light. The world around me was pain. My ribs screamed with every shallow breath, my arm throbbed like fire, and blood trickled down my temple into the dirt. Every instinct begged me to cry out, to move, to reach for Henry, but his words echoed in my mind like a lifeline. "Don't move. Play dead." So I did. I lay still, my body twisted unnaturally against the rocks, eyes half open, chest rising so faintly it looked motionless. My heart pounded so hard I was sure they could hear it, but I kept it hidden beneath the mask of death. A few feet away, I heard Damien groan, dragging himself across the gravel. "Melissa, we survived. We're alive," she whimpered, her voice sharp with pain. "My leg, it's broken, Damien. I can't walk." His tone hardened. "Doesn't matter. We'll crawl if we have to. We have to get help. And when we do, we stick to the story. Do you understand?" Her reply came like poison. "Of course I understand. We've practiced this. The tragic accident. Your parents slipped. We tried to help, but fell too. Poor us, the traumatized survivors." Their laughter, dark, bitter, relieved, sent a shiver through me. I wanted to scream, to leap up and shout, "You murdered your brother. You tried to murder us. You monsters." But instead, I lay still, letting their arrogance dig their grave deeper. Minutes crawled like hours. Damien's voice, though broken by pain, was steady in its cruelty. Remember the details. Dad's foot slipped first. He pulled Mom with him. We tried to grab them, but the ground gave way. Simple, clean. Melissa's tone was icy calm despite her injury. And no one will question it. We have the photos, the picnic food, the perfect setup. I nearly broke my act when I heard her next words. At least now we don't have to pretend we love them anymore. The venom in her voice froze my blood. Gradually, their voices faded as they crawled up the trail, dragging themselves toward what they thought was freedom. The silence they left behind was both a blessing and a curse. My body wanted to collapse into sobs, but I couldn't. Not yet. Then, a faint whisper reached me. Hilda. It was Henry. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. Are you alive? Tears stung my eyes, but I whispered back, yes, badly hurt, but alive. My leg is broken, he groaned. Ribs too, I think, but we made it. We have to hold on, I whispered. We have to survive. For Richard, for the truth. Hours passed before we heard the first voices. Shouts carried from above. Helicopter blades thumped faintly in the distance. Rescuers. Damien and Melissa had found help. I tensed, fear flooding me. If they discovered we were alive too soon, they would finish what they started. We had to keep the act going until we reached safety. They're down here, Damien shouted, his voice perfectly rehearsed. Please, hurry. My parents, they fell. It was an accident. The rescuers' voices answered, calm and authoritative. Stay put. We're coming down. We'll evaluate everyone. Ropes clinked against rock. Boots scraped closer. I felt hands on my neck, searching for a pulse. A man's voice muttered, faint pulse on the male. The woman, very weak, almost gone. Perfect. Paramedics worked swiftly, stabilizing our bodies. I felt straps tighten around me, an oxygen mask press against my face. Every instinct screamed at me to sit up, to beg for help, but I forced myself to remain limp. They're critical, a rescuer reported over radio. Transport immediately. Melissa's sobs filled the air, perfectly timed. Oh God, no, not Mom and Dad. If I hadn't known the truth, I would have believed her. That's how convincing she was. The helicopter ride was agony. Every bump jolted my shattered body. But I clung to the thought, we're alive, we have evidence, this isn't over. At the hospital, chaos swallowed me. Doctors shouted orders. Nurses rushed with IVs and monitors. I kept my eyes closed, feigning unconsciousness. Then I heard them footsteps, whispers. Damien and Melissa. They entered the room, their voices low. Damien leaned close to my bed, his hand brushing mine. Mom, he whispered, poison wrapped in honey. If you can hear me, know this. You should never have asked questions about our finances. Some truths are better left buried, just like Richard. My blood froze. He had confessed. Not in a courtroom, not in front of police, but right here where he thought I was too far gone to hear. And he wasn't alone. A nurse nearby stiffened. I cracked my eyelids just enough to see her face. Young, dark hair pulled back, eyes wide with horror. She had heard him. Hanamatag read. Inns. Later, when Damien and Melissa finally left, Nurse Inns leaned over my bed, her voice barely above a whisper. Ma'am, if you can hear me, move a finger. I summoned every ounce of strength and twitched my index finger. Her breath caught. Oh my God, you're awake. You're pretending. I twitched again, 3 times. Her eyes widened. It was them, wasn't it? They did this to you. 3 more twitches. Yes. She straightened quickly, her face composed, but her eyes blazing. Don't worry. I'll protect you. I'll get the police. For the first time since falling off that cliff, I felt something stronger than fear. Hope. Hours later, Detective Johnson arrived with 2 officers. He leaned close, his voice steady. Mrs. Black, you're safe now. Your nurse told us everything. We'll protect you. But I need to know what really happened up there. With tears in my eyes, I finally whispered the truth. My son and his wife pushed us, just like he pushed Richard 25 years ago. And with that, the mask Damien had worn for decades began to crack. The days that followed at the hospital blurred into a whirlwind of interviews, signatures, and whispered conversations. For the first time in decades, I no longer carried the secret of Richard's death alone. It was out in the open, in the hands of the police, the lawyers, The courts. Henry's hidden recordings, his phone capturing every word of Damien and Melissa's planning, became the backbone of the investigation. Combined with my testimony, the nurse's account, and financial records showing forged signatures and theft, the case was airtight. Still, nothing prepared me for the moment they arrested my son. From my hospital bed, I heard the firm voices echo down the corridor. Damien Black and Melissa Black, you are under arrest for the murder of Richard Black and the attempted murder of Hilda and Henry Black. There was silence, then Melissa's shrill cry. What are you talking about? We're the victims. They fell. It was an accident. The officer's voice was steady. Your in-laws are alive, and they have provided evidence of your crimes. I couldn't see them, but I heard Damien's roar of disbelief. That's impossible. We saw them die. His own words, uncontrollable, furious, were recorded and added to the mountain of evidence. Melissa turned on him in an instant, her voice dripping with venom. It was all his idea. I didn't want to do any of it. He forced me. Damien spat back. You're the one who picked the cliff. You planned the whole thing. In a matter of minutes, the alliance they had built crumbled into dust, each trying to save themselves, clawing at the other with lies. For the first time, their masks were gone. The world saw them as I did, not as loving family, but as predators. Detective Johnson returned to my room that evening, his face a mix of relief and exhaustion. They're both in custody. They'll face trial, and with the evidence we've gathered, it won't just be about what happened on that mountain. We'll finally get justice for Richard, too. At his words, something inside me broke and healed. For 25 years, Richard's voice had been silenced. Now, through us, he would finally speak. The trial came 6 months later. By then, Henry and I had healed enough to walk, though the scars on our bodies and our souls would never fully fade. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with townsfolk, reporters, even strangers, hungry for the spectacle of betrayal. They called it the most shocking family trial of the decade. I sat on the witness stand, my hands trembling, my heart heavy. Across the room, Damien sat in his suit, expression blank, Melissa beside him with her face pale but composed. They looked like any ordinary couple. You would never guess the monsters they were. That was the danger of masks. They looked so ordinary until they cracked. When it was my turn to testify, I told everything. My voice quivered at first, but as I spoke, strength poured into me. I described Richard's death, Damien's thefts, the pressure about the will, the hike, the cliff, the fall, and the whispered confession in the hospital. Every word felt like ripping open an old wound, but also like cleaning out the infection that had poisoned our lives for decades. At the end, I turned to Damien. For the first time in months, I looked directly into his eyes. They were flat, cold, unrecognizable. My son died 25 years ago, I said, my voice firm. The boy I raised, the boy I loved, the boy I thought survived, he didn't make it out of that gorge. What's been living in his place is a stranger, and today, I bury him too. The courtroom was silent. Not even the reporters scribbled. When the jury deliberated, Henry and I held hands, just as we had the night we thought we would die. After 3 long days, the verdict came. Guilty. Damien Black guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder. Melissa Black guilty as an accomplice. The judge's gavel fell like thunder when he sentenced them both to life in prison without parole. Melissa broke down, sobbing, screaming that she had been manipulated. Damien didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, his eyes stared ahead, unrepentant. The mask was finally gone, and all that remained was the hollow man behind it. A year later, our lives looked nothing like they once had. Our house was quieter, older, but filled with new laughter, the laughter of our grandchildren. The courts had granted us custody after Damien and Melissa's convictions. At first, the children were confused, lost, their little voices asking, "When can Mommy and Daddy come home?" But slowly, with love, patience, and honesty suited for their tender ages, they began to heal. Every night I tuck them into bed, their small hands clutching stuffed animals, their eyes heavy with sleep, and every night I tell them stories about their Uncle Richard. Not about his death, not about betrayal, but about the boy he was, kind, protective, full of dreams. I want them to know that goodness runs in their blood too, that they are not defined by the darkness of their parents. Sometimes, when I watch them play in the yard Henry built with his own hands, I feel something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. Henry and I still carry scars visible and invisible. But we are alive. We told the truth. And for the first time in decades, we no longer live under the weight of secrets. So now I turn to you, listening to my story. If you discovered your own child had betrayed you, stolen from you, lied to you, even killed their sibling, could you find the strength to testify against them in court? Could you bear to speak the truth, even if it meant burying the last piece of family you thought you had left? Tell me in the comments. And as you do, let me know where in the world you're watching from. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories, and share this one with someone who needs to hear that truth, no matter how painful, is the only path to freedom. Because sometimes survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about tearing off the masks, facing the monsters hiding behind family ties, and choosing justice no matter the cost.